Chapter 9. For some time after the goblin had gone, Paul sat quite still, looking at a photograph of an unspecified area of Australian sand, seen from above. He didn't feel angry, or sad, or suicidal. If he felt anything, it was as though someone had picked him up like a teapot and poured all the Paul Carpenter out through his ear, leaving him completely empty. When the feeling eventually coagulated into words, he said to himself, "Oh well." As far as he was concerned, he could have sat there all day. Didn't matter. If he hadn't been there, he'd have been at home in his poxy little room, staring at the walls. What difference did it make where you happened to be, anyway? It was as important as the colour of the socks you choose to wear on the day of your execution. Might as well look at a picture of some sand as 4 slabs of masonry covered in beige wood chip. Where you are, when you are, what you're doing, none of it matters a damn when there's nothing left inside you except a huge hole where your life used to be. Not that that mattered either. He'd known from the start that something like this was bound to happen sooner or later. Not even Sir Clive Sinclair in all his glory had ever come up with anything less likely to succeed than the slender hope Paul had built his life around, ever since he'd sat down in the waiting area outside the conference room on the day of his interview and seen the thin girl. Hence, presumably, the absence of any real feeling. The blow, the shock, hadn't exactly hit him out of a clear blue sky. It was like being told that Santa Claus doesn't exist when you're 55 and head of particle physics research at MIT. Sad, depressing, but hardly unexpected. Oh well, he thought, and that was more or less all he had to contribute. That was how Mr. Tanner found him, some unspecified time later. "Well," Mr. Tanner said. Paul looked up. "Sorry?" he said. Mr. Tanner frowned at him. "Have you finished that last lot I gave you?" "No." "Oh. Problems?" Paul shook his head. "It's my fault," he said. "I got sidetracked." He had expected anger, or at the very least another dose of Mr. Tanner's special unpleasantness. Instead he heard him say, "Mum's been in here bothering you, hasn't she?" "She did drop by," Paul replied. "Ah, well, just ignore her. That's what I do. She can be a real pain in the bum when she wants to." "She didn't bother me," Paul replied. Mr. Tanner grinned, presumably because he could read the lie. Dragon black pudding or something of the kind. "Yeah, I wouldn't think to look at her, but she's probably the best metallurgist in Europe," he said. "Not to mention the second richest female in the UK. What did she do? Show you something you'd rather not have seen." "Something like that," Paul replied. Mr. Tanner sat down on the edge of the desk. "There's something you should know about our line of work," he said. "There's no rabbits out of hats, or kissing princesses into frogs, or enchanted talismans that mean you're the ruler of the world. Truth is, even the best of us, even the likes of Theo Van Spee or Judy de Castel Bianco, we're like a bunch of Trowbridge Islanders with a machine gun. Don't know how it works, can't fix it if it breaks down, can't build one from scratch, but we can point it where we want to and squeeze a trigger. And when we do that, stuff happens. But the machine gun's still a machine gun. You can't paint a wall with it, or cook a chicken, or sew a button on a shirt. You can use it for X, Y, and Z, and that's all. Everything else in life, just shit that happens. And if that's the way it wants to go, there's nothing you or I or even Wells can do about it." He stretched forward, picked up a photograph that Paul had already marked up, and looked at it. "What we can do," he said, "is our job, and a fat lot of good it may do most of the time, but the same's true of builders and dentists and people behind tills in petrol stations. We all just carry on, and that's that." "I know," Paul said, "and I'll get this lot done, I promise." Mr. Tanner stood up. "You'd better," he said. "There's people relying on you. Even if they are just a bunch of bauxite miners in Australia, you couldn't be expected to give a flying fuck about." He grinned, but it wasn't a Mr. Tanner grin. "And you know why?" he said. "Because somewhere in the world there's some poor little shit like you who's got a hatful of problems, can't for the life of him see why the hell he should bother, but still he gets on and does his job, the thing he's supposed to be doing. And what he does is just some meaningless garbage to him, but to you, he's the answer to all your troubles, the light at the end of the tunnel, the miracle you were sure you could never happen, but it does, and suddenly everything's just fine when you least expect it. Don't ask me why it's like that, but it is. So you just get on with finding bauxite in the desert and leave fixing your problem to whoever it is supposed to do it. That way,
We all do our job, and everybody gets paid on Friday.
Paul looked at him and came to the conclusion that the effects of the dragon turd must have worn off already.
Fine, he said. Just leave it to me.
Then he added, just out of interest, though.
Yes?
Well, Paul said, frowning slightly, if you're right, and we're all busy helping other people, and that they're all busy helping us, that is what you were saying, isn't it?
More or less.
Fine, Paul said. In that case, what exactly does your mother do? Mr. Tanner thought for a moment.
Buggers people about, mostly, he replied. When you finish that lot, bring 'em up to my office and I'll give you the next batch, okay?
It was a very long weekend. Mr. Tanner kept him scrying bits of Australia until gone on 5 o'clock, then turned him loose with a growled, "Thanks," and a turned back. Paul went straight home, sat in his chair until 10 o'clock, and went to bed. Sunday seemed to last forever. On Monday morning, he arrived at the office at 9 o'clock exactly, and shuffled into reception, shoes full of lead, back arched, head bowed. The receptionist on duty was even more stunningly beautiful than usual. A complete stranger, of course, but he was used to that by now. But he looked away and was almost at the fire door when she called out, "Morning, Paul," in a bright, loud voice. He mumbled some sort of reply. "Cheer up," the receptionist said. "Maybe it'll never happen." "Fuck you," Paul thought. "Charming," the receptionist replied. "So you still think I'm horrible, then?" Paul stopped dead and turned slowly around. The girl behind the desk was slender and golden-haired, with a long, graceful neck, high cheekbones, a full mouth, and a sparkling blue eyes. "Sorry?" Paul said. "Apology accepted," said the girl. "How was your weekend, then?" "Boring," Paul said, and then, "Excuse me if this sounds rude, but do I know you?" She laughed, and then she held out her hand, palm facing him. He wasn't sure what that was supposed to mean, but he went back to the desk. He was obviously supposed to look at her hand, but he couldn't. Then he saw them, 4 tiny red dots in the centre of the palm. They were about a centimetre apart, and if he'd had a felt tip pen handy and joined them up, they'd have formed a square. Paul stared at them for a moment, and then at the girl. "Mrs. Tanner," he said. She giggled. "Don't tell anybody, but Dennis's dad and I never actually got married. You couldn't pronounce my name, but if you like, you can call me Rosie." "Rosie," Paul repeated. "Look, are you—" She grinned, and there was the family resemblance once again. "You think I'm horrible, and you wouldn't eat my cake. You looked in my seer stone. You saw that thin cow having it off with—" "Yes," Paul said quickly. "All right." He couldn't think of anything else to say. "I like helping out in the office," she went on. "It's something to do, even if it does mean I've got to wear the monkey suit. Really, I don't know how you lot can stand it. Bloody tight skin and these things." She patted her bust. "Barbaric, I call it. And don't get me started about going to the toilet. Still, I suppose it's all a matter of what you're used to." I like it," Paul said awkwardly. It suits you, I mean." She laughed. "Dennis doesn't think so," she said. "You should hear him. Bloody hell, Mum, you aren't going to the office wearing that, are you? He should talk. I mean, he's nothing to write home about himself, whichever way you look at it." Quickly, Paul reviewed all the possible responses that came to mind and realised that none of them was satisfactory. Not that it mattered, since the girl, the goblin, had already demonstrated that she could read his mind. Is that what you usually wear, or do you—" "I'm like Joan Collins," Mr. Tanner's mum replied. "Wouldn't be seen dead wearing the same outfit twice, or hadn't you noticed?" Paul's eyes opened wide. "You mean every day it's actually you?" She shook her head. "Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. Tuesdays and Thursdays it's my sister. We take it in turns. You can call her Auntie Pam if you want." Paul tried to remember a Tuesday, and an image slipped into his mind of a sultry Malaysian beauty with a waterfall of shining black hair. "Auntie Pam," he repeated. "Fine. Why are you telling me this? Today, I mean." She shrugged. "I was just wondering, that's all," she said. "Like, if you'd spent all weekend scoffing those dragon shit beans, you'd have seen me like I really am. But obviously not. Also," she said, "I like you. You're weedy and pathetic, and you've got some bloody weird notions about women. But you remind me of my brother, Uncle Alf," she added. "Rest his soul. Lose the ape costume, and you'd be the spitting image of Alf when he was your age." "I see," Paul said. "So what happened to him, then?" She clicked her tongue. "Oh, killed," she said. "Most of us get killed sooner or later. We like to play rough games when we've got the place to ourselves." "Oh," Paul said. I'm sorry." "Balls. You think we're disgusting and horrible, but that's all right. We think the same about your lot, except you. You're sweet." Fine, Paul thought, and managed not to shudder, even though his restraint was pointless. "Thanks," he said. "I suppose I better go and do some work now." "No rush," she replied. "Come on, you can't kid me. Last thing you want to do is go and sit in that office the rest of the day with her. Talk about embarrassing." "You're right," Paul said, "but I've got to, haven't I?" "I suppose," she grinned again. Bright and early she was, waiting on the doorstep. "I don't like her much. Goes round looking like a starving kitten. But she knows which side her bread's buttered. You mark my words. Oh, and here's a tip for you. Whatever you do, don't look at her neck. On the right-hand side, about 2 inches down from the ear." She frowned. "And you lot think we're like animals," she said. "Try that lark where I come from. You'll get your throat ripped out." This time Paul did shudder. I wish you hadn't told me that," he said. "Yes, well, Dennis always says, if I'd only joined the diplomatic corps when I was a girl, we could have had all sorts of really interesting wars. But our lot don't hold with careers for women back then. Still don't, actually. Fuck 'em, I say." "Right," Paul replied. "But I'd better be going. It was nice talking to you." "Liar," she laughed, and pushed a wave of golden hair back over her slim shoulder. Paul made a resolution not to eat any of the remaining beans on a Monday, a Wednesday, or a Friday. "You carry on, then," she said. "Only, if you get bored sick, or the atmosphere in your office gets more than you can stand, here's a tip for you. It wasn't just beans you found in that drawer, remember?" Paul frowned. "Sorry?" "Go and take a look if you've forgotten," she said. "The instructions are pretty clear, but if you need any help, just ask. Only, I wouldn't go mentioning it to our Dennis if I were you, or any of the other partners, come to that. They can get a bit snotty sometimes when it's stuff like that." Paul remembered one of the things that had been in the drawer beside the beans. "You mean the stapler?" She shook her head and pointed. The stapler was on the desk next to her. "Have a nice day," she said. He walked away down the corridor and up the stairs, thinking, Auntie Pam and Uncle Alf and Mr. Tanner's mum Rosie. Jesus fucking Christ! And then he reached the door of his office. Their office. Damn. Sophie looked up as he walked in, then immediately turned her head. Just as well he could only see her left profile. He sat down on his side of the desk and looked down at his hands. "Julie came in a moment or so ago," she said in a quiet, awkward voice. "She left some more of these for us to do." The spreadsheets. Paul had never imagined the day would come when he'd be glad to see a tall stack of the horrible things, but at that moment they were as welcome as shelter in a blizzard. He grabbed his share and set to work on them as though his life depended on it. "Good weekend," Sophie said. "All right," Paul grunted back. "How about you?" He hadn't meant to say that. It just slipped out, like a cat curving itself round the edge of a slightly open door. "Great," she mumbled. "Actually, Good," Paul snapped. "Look, if you don't mind, I'd better get on with this lot. The sooner it's done, the sooner they give us something else." "Okay, fine," she whispered. He looked up. "What?" "Doesn't matter." She had her left hand clamped over the right side of her neck, as though she'd just been stung by a bug. I'll tell you later." "All right." Work. Beautiful, mindless work. Just complicated enough to keep one's thoughts from wandering, but purely abstract, nothing to do with anything. There were moments in the long drag down to lunchtime when he forgot about the human presence a few feet away from him across the desktop. Amazing, but apparently possible, like the fools who build villages on the slopes of volcanoes. 1 o'clock came, and at least she had the compassion to go out for lunch. You coming?" she asked. Damn, it was almost as if she wanted him to. No, he replied. I've got sandwiches. Besides, I could do some more of this garbage. Fine, she said. See you later, then. He didn't reply, and the door closed behind her, at which point it was safe for Paul to look up and push his chair back. Work was all right in its place, but he'd had enough of spreadsheets to last him this life and several dozen reincarnations. It wasn't just beans you found in that drawer, remember? Sure, he remembered now. A funny little cardboard tube and that plastic sheet thing. He took it out, put it on the desk and turned it over a few times with the tips of his fingers. By rights, it ought to be back in the strong room, assuming, of course, that it was the same one as he'd found there while he was compiling the inventory. He frowned. There was something almost familiar about the stupid thing, as if there had been a time when he knew what it was. Instructions, he remembered. The goblin female, just call me Rosie, had said something about instructions. He couldn't remember having seen anything like that. But when he teased the rolled-up sheet out of the tube, a little wisp of very thin paper fluttered out and landed on the desk. There was writing on it. Tiny little letters he couldn't read. Yes, he could. He had to hold the paper right up close to the tip of his nose, but the more he squinted at it, the easier it got. J.W.Wells portable door, patent number 55674, the 15th of August 1872, 94239, 23rd of February 1875, by appointment. Well, that didn't help much. He looked again, and the letters seemed to grow larger. To use the portable door, first remove it from the cardboard tube. To ensure flawless operation, first spread the door out on a flat surface, taking care to smooth out any wrinkles, as these may inhibit adherence or corrupt the intelligence. Make a careful mental note of all aspects of desired arrival. Lift the door by the top corners, making sure that the door remains flat and level at all times. Press the door firmly against the wall until it adheres without support. Release corners, smooth out wrinkles as previously advised. Grasp the handle firmly in the right hand and rotate 1/2 turn to the left. Apply gentle, even pressure to open the door. You are most earnestly advised to use some convenient object of suitable weight to hold the door ajar during use. If possible, limit exposures to no more than 1 hour, observe time, per visit. Reverse the above procedure for disassembly and removal. Store only in the container provided, away from extremes of heat and cold, and out of the reach of children, invalids, and persons of a nervous or prosaic disposition. Crazy as a tank full of randy piranhas. He turned the slip of paper over, but there was nothing to see except the shadow of the letters coming through from the other side. Who ever heard of a portable door? And what the hell would be the point? He remembered something. A room without a door. A place where he lived, though not in his own time. Of course, that had been just a dream, and he was wide awake now. A portable door, for Christ's sake. On the other hand, Just Call Me Rosie had made it sound like the best thing since hallucinogenic chocolate. True, he had absolutely no reason whatsoever to trust the recommendations of a malicious female goblin who was also Mr. Tanner's old mum. Still, just supposing it worked, that it really was a folding or collapsible door, what possible harm could it do? Either it was a dud, in which case nothing would happen, or it wasn't, in which case, if he slapped it on the back wall of his office, he'd be able to take a shortcut through to the computer bay without having to go down the corridor and up and down 2 flights of steps. Mega deal. Paul thought it over as he stared at the thing, still tightly curled like a fine Cuban cigar. On reflection, he could think of various uses for something of the sort, ranging from the innocuous, left your keys in your other jacket and locked yourself out, don't worry, the J.W.Wells portable door, to the downright larcenous, or worse, just the sort of thing a bank robber would love to find in his Christmas stocking mask, or the ideal present for the 12th level ninja master assassin who has everything. Yes, but it wouldn't work. Went without saying. It had to be some sort of gimmick, like the genuine authentic phaser pistols and lightsabers you saw advertised in the back pages of magazines for sad people. Maybe it was just that, a piece of tie-in marketing for a TV show that bombed or got cancelled before it was ever released. In which case, it'd do no harm just to offer it up against a handy slab of plasterwork, would it? Paul was aware of a very strange, though barely perceptible sensation. The nearest parallel he could think of was a desperate nicotine craving, as experienced by someone who'd never smoked. Once again, he had the weirdest notion that he was familiar with this ludicrous object. Furthermore, the urge to use it was linked to that memory like a withdrawal symptom, a suppressed addiction, yearning for satisfaction in the presence of the forbidden luxury. That was all very well, but whatever it was starting to make him feel distinctly uncomfortable. He felt jumpy, restless, hungry and stuffed all at the same time. His hands were actually shaking just a little, and the inside of his mouth was salty and furry. All of these unpleasant sensations would, he knew, vanish at once just as soon as he unrolled the little plastic sheet and pressed it to a wall. At the back of his mind, red alert sirens sounded as he recognised the intrusion of another slice of supernatural loopiness into his life, but he had to ignore them. He stood up. He put the instructions down on the seat of Sophie's chair and followed them carefully. First, he smoothed the thing out on the desktop. It looked just the same as it had a short while ago, except that now there were 2 tiny keyholes, each with a neatly traced baroque escutcheon surrounding it, above and below the doorknob. Next, he lifted it by the corners in the prescribed fashion and pressed it against the wall as if hanging a sheet of thin wallpaper. He felt it stick, as if it had magnets on it. Carefully, he pressed out a few small wrinkles and bulges, brushing with the back of his hand in a herringbone pattern. Then he took a step back and looked at it. Either he was imagining it, or the thing had grown. It was now as tall and wide as a full-sized door, and the handle had somehow acquired an extra dimension. In fact, it was brass, polished and shiny. He reached out and touched it with the tip of his forefinger. It felt cold and smooth. Son of a bitch, he thought. Then he checked the instructions to see what the next step was. You are most earnestly advised to use some convenient object of suitable weight to hold the door ajar during use. Ajar. When is a door not a door? Somehow the old joke struck him as being even less funny than usual. He looked around, and there on the desk, hunched like a thin black rabbit, was a long stapler. He was way past the point where he was surprised to see it there, even though it had been in reception that morning, and he hadn't noticed anybody bring it into the room. He frowned at it. Definitely an object of suitable weight, and there didn't seem to be anything else in the room that would serve as a makeshift doorstop. He picked it up, and then feeling extremely foolish, he reached out and twisted the doorknob. The door opened. As soon as it was open, it had changed. It had weight. Its frame and lintel and the mouldings between its panels stood out in generous relief. No possible doubt about it, nature might stand up and say to all the world, "This is a door." Oh well, he thought, and peeked through it. But there was nothing to see, only darkness and shadows. If that was the computer bay out there, somebody had switched off all the lights and drawn the curtains. Creepy, but he was painfully aware that he couldn't stop now, or the withdrawal symptoms would be back, 100 times worse. Whether he liked it or not, he was going through. But first, he glanced at his watch. 01:09:56. Opened the door a little bit wider, then stooped down and snuggled the stapler up against it, tight as a cat rubbing against your leg, and then make a careful note of all aspects of desired arrival. Or, as Bill Gates would put it, where do you want to go today? But that was just plain silly. Either it went nowhere, or it went through into the computer bay. Yes, but if he had a choice, where would it go? If he had the whole world to choose from? It was like when someone said, "What shall we talk about?" or "Just say something into the microphone." He couldn't think of anywhere he wanted to go, really. All places are the same after all. Doesn't matter where you are. If your life is a polo mint and the only girl you've ever really loved is the hole in the middle. But all things being equal, he'd always rather fancied seeing Venice. Paul walked through the door, caught his foot in a coil of rope, and only just managed to avoid falling into a canal. The first thing he did was look around. There, in the middle of a crumbling red brick wall, was the door, slightly ajar, with a stapler wedged in it. Next to it was what looked like a theatre poster, but in Italian. He turned slowly back. There was the canal. There was the coil of rope. Below, bobbing up and down on the green water, was a small motorboat. 3 Japanese women walked past him, talking very fast, followed by a businessman in an expensive-looking suit. Away to his right, he could see a yellow fingerboard nailed to the facade of a tall, ancient building. Piazza S. Marco, it said, and an arrow pointed into the distance. On the other hand, he was feeling a whole lot better. No shaking hands, no salty taste, no squirmy itch. Something prompted him to check his watch. 01:09:56. Ahoy! he thought. My watch has stopped. He looked around and caught sight of a clock high up on the tower of some church or similar building. 1:10. But that wasn't right, because there was a time difference. Italy was an hour behind, or 2 hours ahead or something. He looked at his watch again. 01, 09, 55. And then he ground his toe against the pavement. It felt solid enough. Also, he could feel a slight breeze on his face, and there was also the smell. Salt, fresh algae, and vintage fish. Not imaginary. Not far down the road, in the other direction, there was a cafe. He thought for a moment, and then, having glanced back to make sure the door and the stapler were where he'd left them, he wandered down the street towards it. There were chairs and tables outside, 2 men sitting at one of them, both talking loudly into mobile phones. Of course, he didn't have any Italian money, so he couldn't buy a coffee or a slice of cake. They had about 900 different varieties of cake in the window. Yum! Then one of the phoning men stuck a cigarette in his face, reached down to the table, picked up a book of matches, and lit one. Paul checked the table nearest to him, and sure enough, there was an identical book of matches, in a black shiny cover, with the name of the cafe in gold letters and its phone number, God help us, its website address. Paul looked round to see if anybody was watching, and then slipped the matchbook into his pocket. Nobody grabbed him or called for the police, so he guessed that he'd got away with it. He felt guilty, stealing from inoffensive strangers, but all he could think to do was to reach in his trouser pocket for some English change. He found a 20p piece and put it on the table. It was the thought that counted, he asserted. Like hell, replied his better self. It was pleasantly warm. A pair of girls clicked by on monster heels, sunglasses loud and lilting voices, calls that looked like they'd cost more than he'd earn in a year, if he lived that long. A waiter came out of the cafe and cleared away the dead cups and plates. The 20p piece puzzled him. In the end, he balanced it on his thumbnail, flicked it 2 feet up in the air, caught it backhanded and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. He smiled at Paul as he went past. It was just a reflex, but it wasn't a goblin grin. A cup of coffee, Paul thought. One of those shiny chocolate things that looked like a scale model of the Kremlin. I could really fancy that. The slight breeze gusted sharply, and something blew against his cheek. At first he thought it was a leaf, but there weren't any trees in sight. He retrieved it, and saw it was a banknote. What the hell, he thought. The banknote was blue, and the row of noughts behind the figure 5 looked like the stream of bubbles left behind by a diving otter. But Italian money was funny stuff, he remembered. Buy £4.50 worth of peanuts and give the man a fiver, and the change would be enough to make you a lira millionaire. Still, he felt braver than usual for some reason, and sat down at the nearest table. When the waiter came up, he held out the banknote and said, "Excuse me." The slight quiver of the waiter's upper lip made it obvious that he'd placed Paul as an Englishman, but he was polite and dignified, as all native Venetians are, and he didn't spit. "Excuse me," Paul repeated slowly, "but can I buy a cup of coffee with this?" This time the waiter did grin. No family resemblance, though. Si. "Right, uno café, por favor?" "1 coffee," said the waiter. "Anything else?" One of the advantages of making a fool of yourself is that you don't have to worry about looking foolish. Can I afford anything else?" The waiter's grin spread into a smile. "Si. I'll have that then, please." Coming right up, the waiter went away and came back with a coffee and one of the Kremlin buns. Paul tried to give him the banknote, but he looked shocked and handed Paul a little slip of paper, which he took to be the bill. He apologised. The waiter forgave him and went away. The coffee was wonderful, and the cake was better, even if it did split its seams and gush confectioner's custard up his jacket sleeves. He took his time, paying proper attention to the taste of the coffee and the texture of the pastry. It was only when he'd finished both, and surreptitiously licked the last splodge of errant custard off the underside of his wrist, that it occurred to him to look at the church clock he'd noticed earlier. Fuck, he thought, 2:05. He jumped up, wedged the banknote and the bill under the sugar cellar, and dashed back down the street. He'd forgotten all about the door, but there it was, patient and steadfast as the HMV dog. He nudged the stapler aside with his foot, pushed the door open and went through. To his relief, he found himself standing in his office. There, on Sophie's chair, was the little piece of paper with the instructions. Sophie wasn't back from lunch yet. A thought struck him, and he looked at his watch. 01:10:02. He'd been away for 6 seconds. Not even that. Come to think of it, he'd stood in the doorway that long. He hadn't been away at all. He turned around just as the door, or rather the little plastic sheet, peeled off the wall and flopped onto the floor. Shit, he said to himself. So I did just imagine it after all. But he'd thought of that, he remembered, and done a proper scientific test. He felt in his pocket, and there was the book of matches, with the name, phone number, and website. Shit, he thought again. First things first, he rolled up the plastic sheet and stuffed it, together with the instruction slip, back in its tube. Then he hesitated. Properly speaking, it should go back in the drawer where he found it, or, better still, in the strong room. Yeah, right, he thought, and tucked the cardboard tube carefully away in his inside pocket. He looked around for the stapler, but it had vanished again. For a moment he wondered if he'd left it on the other side of the door, but he could distinctly remember stepping over it on his side as he came through. Not that it mattered a damn. Well, thought Paul, so it's a portable door. Not bad. Just a thing for beating the rush hour traffic, assuming it could be aimed with anything approaching precision, and perfect for those spur-of-the-moment impulse holidays, particularly if it was really true and the time he'd spent on the other side hadn't actually happened back here. Nobody had raised the subject of holiday entitlement since he'd been with the firm. Presumably he'd suspected for the same reason that maximum security prisoners on Dartmoor don't get asked where they fancy going for their annual outing this year. But if the door worked the way it seemed to do, he could have had 3 weeks in Martinique every day in his lunch hour. Of course, spending money and hotel bills might be a problem, or maybe not. If the door could also let him into, say, Fort Knox, or the vaults of the bank of his choice. At that point, though, his train of thought jumped the track. It wasn't just that doing that sort of thing wasn't right, and if his mother got to hear of it, he'd have hell to pay. There was also the unpleasant feeling that that was precisely the sort of thing the door wanted him to do, and maybe it wasn't quite as user-friendly as he might have supposed. Sneaking off work, he reckoned, was probably all right. Thieving, on the other hand, could well be something quite other. The dark side of the force, or something to that effect. He could be quite wrong about that, of course, but on balance, it'd be better not to risk it. At least not until he'd had the opportunity to run a few more controlled tests, acquire a bit more data. Suddenly he realised that he was feeling extremely tired, as if he hadn't slept for several days. That also put a rather different complexion on the matter, since he felt it was a pretty safe bet that the door was somehow responsible for that too. Clearly he was guessing, but it seemed likely that if he felt worn out after 10 minutes or so on the other side, more than an hour over there would leave him exhausted, and 3 weeks, for all he knew, it could kill him. Further tests, he resolved, more data. Characters in TV sci-fi series might press unidentified buttons just to see what they do and live to tell the tale, but he didn't have the comfort of knowing that his name was in the cast list in next week's TV Times. Even so, he had to admit it. Most of the ambient weirdness he'd run into since joining J.W.Wells & Co. had ranged from unpleasant to downright nasty. But this was different. In fact, if it was any cooler, you could stick it in a corner and sell it as ice cream. He leaned back in his chair, which had never felt so comfortable. He felt ever so slightly pleased with himself, more so than if he'd found a pound coin in the street, rather less than if he'd just discovered a new sea route to the east. At the back of his mind, there was a nagging fear that he'd just taken a left turn in the maze and had got a crumb of cheese instead of an electric shock, but it didn't bother him all that much. Cheese, after all, is cheese. He was just wondering whether, after all, he ought to wander down to reception when the lunch hour was over and ask the Mrs. Tanner Goblin if she could throw any more light on the matter, when he caught sight of his watch, 3 minutes past 2, and the door opened and in came Sophie. He snapped upright in his chair, almost guiltily, because he wasn't going to tell her about it. Not now, not after what she'd done to him. That was, of course, just plain silly, but nevertheless. And there went a large slice of the pleasure of the discovery, of course. But he couldn't help that. He wasn't the one who'd chosen to go frolicking with performance potters and buses. He grabbed a bunch of spreadsheets and scowled at them as if it was all their fault. "Hello," she said. He grunted back. She was looking at him. "I thought you were going to get on with some work," she said. "Yes," he replied. "Well, you don't look like you've got much done." "No," he replied. Another moment, and suddenly he felt awful, as if he'd just trodden on a baby field mouse. But it was too late to do anything about it. She sat down opposite him and reached for her pile of printouts. The moment froze over, like the Arctic Sea in winter, cutting them off from each other, and for the next few hours they grimly did spreadsheets at each other. which was ridiculous. They hadn't talked to each other properly since that horrible night when they'd got locked in, and Paul found himself charging through the building with a spear in his hand, desperately trying to save her from a pack of goblins holding knives under her throat. Since then, they'd found out that magic was real and that they were magicians, that they were trapped in the weirdness up to their necks forever, but with the implied promise that if they stuck at it, worked hard and kept their noses clean, they might in time rise up the corporate ladder and themselves become secret masters of the universe. And now Paul had stumbled across a piece of really big medicine of his very own, something that might just mean they could escape, or at the very least adjust the balance of weirdness in their own favour. And here they were, a million miles apart across a desk, sorting through bits of ludicrous paper, all because Sophie had met a bloke she liked. It was as though America had refused to help Britain in World War II because it was jealous of Britain having the benefit of the Gulf Stream. Obvious. But did that mean he was going to stop acting like a 5-year-old and talk to her? Did it, Ella's like. At 29 minutes past 5, they both got up, put on their coats, and left the office in complete silence, not looking at each other. As they walked through reception, Call Me Rosie gave Paul a dazzling smile. Startled the life out of him, and he stopped dead for a moment. Sophie pushed past him and hurried out of the door. "Snotty cow," said Call Me Rosie blithely. "Dunno why you're wasting your time on her." Paul gave her a horrified look and retreated in bad order. The next few weeks were confusing, to say the least. Needless to say, Paul couldn't resist playing with the portable door, partly because it was fun, but also because while he was using it, he forgot about Sophie and the performance putter. Once he became aware of it, this effect puzzled him greatly, if only because it was so marked. He'd be brooding darkly as he stepped over the threshold, and the moment he came back through, he'd catch up the train of thought at exactly the point where he'd left it. But while he was out there, in the streets of Rio or Florence, or treading the flower-carpeted slopes of Nepal, or the ramparts of the Great Wall of China, she was completely out of his mind, like a distant cousin's forgotten birthday. It was a while before he realised he could use his bank card to draw foreign money out of holes in the walls from Anchorage to Adelaide. When eventually he cottoned on, he was nevertheless cautious at first, since on his J.W.Wells salary he had to think twice about splashing out on a coffee and a bacon roll in London, let alone sushi in Yokohama or green tea and honey cakes in Samarkand. But then his bank statement arrived, and he saw to his great bewilderment and joy that none of the withdrawals he'd made in his various jaunts were recorded there. Even then, he was inclined to believe that this was simply because it took foreign currency transactions longer to reach the computer, and that sooner or later they'd come home to roost like a squadron of B-52 chickens. But his next bank statement told him the same thing. Apparently he could buy what the hell he liked and not have to pay for it. Ever. Unfortunately, there was more to it than that, as he discovered on his return home after a frenzied tour of the jeweller's quarter in Paris. He'd bought a whole load of stuff. Gold watches, coins, rings, anything and everything made of the yellow stuff he'd been able to cram into his pockets. He could feel it all clinking and digging into him through the cloth of his coat. But as soon as he crossed the line, the extra weight and sharp edges vanished, and when he shoved his hands into his pockets, he found nothing more valuable than his keys, a dead bridle, a packet of Kleenex, and the inevitable unwrapped, fluff-coated boiled sweet. The full weirdness of that took a little while to sink in, because he'd bought the Kleenex in Paris at the same time as all the gold. But apparently, the invisible, intangible customs officers assigned to his case had either overlooked it or let him keep it as a consolation prize. Next day, just for fun, he went to Manchester and drew out £50. When he got back to St Mary Axe, it had gone. When he repeated the experiment the next day and drew out £10, it was still there when he stepped back through the door, but a quick balance check on the way home showed the withdrawal. While he was trying to figure this one out over the next few days, he became aware of another consistent effect. No matter how much he ate while he was away, he seemed to have no impact on his appetite when he got back. Also, in spite of all the choux pastry and gâteau he was scoffing in the pavement cafes of the world, he hadn't put on any weight. At this point, he resolved to give up trying to rationalise and concentrate on enjoying his daily holiday. One encouraging trend was that once Paul started using the door on a daily basis, the period of exhaustion that followed once he came back was gradually decreasing, to the point where he was able to risk staying for 2 hours, observed time, without having to struggle to stay awake after the rest of the day. An hour hadn't really given him much time for more than a search for a bank machine, followed by a hasty lunch. With double the time at his disposal, he could enjoy a leisurely meal and still be able to fit in a little gentle sightseeing. The only thing lacking from his excursions was, of course, company. Wherever he went, he was a stranger. This, in fact, seemed to be one of the rules, since he'd gone back to the same coffee shop in Houston 3 days in a row and found the same man behind the counter on each occasion, but there'd been no indication whatsoever that he'd been recognised. Of course, that wasn't necessarily significant. Paul had no illusions whatsoever about his memorability, but he found it odd that a wool-suited Englishman could turn up 3 days running in a Texan diner without exciting some comment. Once the initial excitement of the discovery had worn off, and he decided to get blasé about the foreign travel aspect, he'd come to think of his trips through the door as just a rather more pleasant way to spend his lunch hour than sitting in the office munching stale cheese sandwiches. Though, since the food through the door didn't have any nutritional value, he had to do that as well. It was still the high spot of his day, and a couple of hours' break from the embarrassed misery of sharing an office with Sophie was particularly welcome. But the fact remained that the door was little more than an entertaining toy. He could sip lattes in Manhattan or swill wheat beer in Munich. Like money, alcohol didn't seem able to travel back through the door. But afterwards he had to come home and spend the afternoon sorting spreadsheets in grim silence until it was time to catch the bus back to Kentish Town. He tried not to acknowledge it, but if someone had offered to swap him the door for just one of those lunchtimes he'd shared with Sophie in the miserable little Italian sandwich bar around the corner, 100 years ago, or so it seemed now, he'd have jumped at the chance. One Wednesday, Paul was sitting outside a cafe in Ankara, nursing a cup of Turkish coffee. He'd only tried it because he couldn't believe it could be as bad as everybody reckoned, and was reflecting that it wasn't only cats who were liable to come to a bad end because of curiosity, when a female voice behind and above his head asked if anyone was sitting in the other chair. He was too preoccupied to lie, and it was only after the voice's proprietor had sat down opposite him, casting his shadow over his face, that it occurred to him that she'd made her request in English, or at least Australian. He looked up, mildly intrigued. She was tall and slim, about 20, probably half Chinese and half European, with long black hair under a round, broad-rimmed straw hat. She was also bewilderingly pretty, in a traffic-stopping, accident-causing shampoo advertisement sort of way, and she was smiling at him. "Hi," she said. "You're English, aren't you?" Her eyes were as bright as the headlights of an oncoming truck, and Paul was a hedgehog. Yes," he said. "Thought so." She lifted a coffee cup to her lips and blew on the foam. "Is that Turkish coffee you're drinking?" "Yes. What's it like?" "Mud," Paul replied. "You don't like it much, then?" "No." "Ah, well," she pursed her lips at him. "I was going to give it a go. Like, if you're in Turkey, people expect you to try the coffee. But if it's that bad..." "It is. Worse." "That bad?" She nodded gravely. "Thank you," she said. "In that case, I'll stick to the regular stuff." She poked the tip of her tongue into the froth. Paul began to sweat. "Have you tried the tea as well?" Turkish tea, you mean?" She nodded. "No." "Good," she said. "In that case, I can return the favour." "Don't." "Right," Paul said. It's bad, is it?" She frowned. "No worse than a bad hangover," she said. "And probably better than drowning. You been in Turkey long?" Paul shook his head. "Only just arrived," he said. "Me too. Are you here for work or just wandering about?" "Just wandering," Paul said. "Ah, only I thought because you're wearing a suit and tie and all." Paul smiled weakly. "Fashion statement," he said. "Really?" She raised an impeccably profiled eyebrow. Paul nodded. "True, it's the sort of statement that gets taken down in writing and used in evidence against you, but..." "A fashion confession. Actually, it suits you." Liar, Paul thought. "Really?" "Yeah," she said. "Sort of. It's like the hard-boiled, ill-fitting, slept-in newspaper man look. Really, of course. You should have 3 days' growth of designer stubble and be bashing away at your laptop or to get the proper effect. Still, it's sort of cute." Paul hadn't really noticed what the girl was wearing, in roughly the same way that 99 out of 100 visitors to the Louvre hadn't been able to tell you much about the Mona Lisa's frame. He looked. He recognised the basic type as a sundress, but he didn't know enough about female clothes to tell whether it was something off a market stall or a masterpiece of couture that had cost the equivalent of the US defence budget. Irrelevant in any case. thanks, he mumbled. Yours too. Suits you, I mean. She looked at him and smiled, or rather she grinned. That old family resemblance. Paul's eyes widened like the San Andreas fault on a bad day. Mrs. He checked himself. Rosie? She scowled. Bagger, she said. And for a fraction of a second, Paul was sitting opposite a lemur-faced, hook-taloned goblin. Then she raised her hands and lifted her hair back over her shoulders. It was a gesture straight off a fashion shoot that would have made Paul's heart crack a rib. But somehow or other it didn't work. Hello, Paul, she said. He stared at her. What are you doing here? He demanded. She shrugged. Same as you, she said. Lunch hour. Thought I'd slip out of the office for a bit, get some sun. Breaks stay up nicely, don't you think? A few yards away, a passing businessman walked into a lamppost. As he scrambled to his feet, he shot Paul a furious look, as if demanding how come a scruff like him was sitting there whispering sweet nothings to something like that. Paul noticed. Made him want to shudder. But how did you get here? He asked. Same way as you, Dumbo. Told you about it, remember? So I just sort of snuck in after you'd gone through. And here I am. Wonderful thing, isn't it? Paul nodded. Bloody marvellous, he grunted. Look. He took a deep breath. He didn't want to ask the question that was hammering at the gate of his teeth, but he went ahead anyway. Look, he repeated. Just now, were you... She gave him a smile that would have melted a glacier. Was I what? Paul closed his eyes. Were you trying to... chat me up? She giggled. Chat you up? She repeated. Bloody hell, don't think I've heard that expression since... Were you? The smile faded, and she shrugged. Can't blame a girl for trying, she said. Oh. Now she was grinning. The special secret grin of the House of Tanner. You should see your face, she said. Instinctively, Paul tried to look normal. Sorry, he said. But, for crying out loud, you're Mr. Tanner's mother. So? Well, Paul didn't bother trying to complete the sentence. She knew what he meant. That grin again. Picky bugger, aren't you? And there was me thinking I'd found Mr. Right, and at last, shallow, immature, wrong-track mind. Desperate, she added pleasantly. That's got to be the one, she went on. I mean, anyone who's pathetic enough to go mooning around like a spaniel with the runs over a boring, miserable, bony little... Look, Paul said. Mr. Tanner's mum fluttered her eyelashes at him. He'd never actually seen it done before. Now me, she said. I'm shallow. I'm so shallow I'm bloody rice paddy. Definitely a one-track mind. Also, she added with a faint sigh, desperate. But at least I don't moon about. Acquire target, lock and load. It's always been my motto. It's the goblin way. It's cultural. Like ancestor worship or Morris dancing. She shook her head. I'm not saying it's perfect, mind, she added fairly. I mean, look what I got out of it. Dennis. But really, I'd have thought it'd suit you down to the ground. Paul's spine crawled. No offence, he said, but... Yeah, I'm a goblin. So fucking what? She scowled, and a dozen or so assorted males saw her and thought, what an incredibly gorgeous scowling girl. Why should you care? It may only be skin deep, but it's a bloody sight better than you'll ever get either way. It doesn't wash off or peel away or full moon or anything. I can be like this as long as I want, or I can do blonde if you'd rather. No, said Paul. Suit yourself, she sighed. Bloody fool, that's what you are, though. You want to know where your precious Sophie is right now? No. Tough. She closed her fist, then opened it again, and on the flat of her palm was a little round glass globe, which shone like a bonsai star. Paul tried to look away, but the light held him, and in the heart of the globe he could see the miserable Italian sandwich bar, and inside that a table, and on one side of it the back of a man's head, and over his shoulder... Mrs. Tanner closed her hand. Your special table, she said, where you and she went when she bought you that ham roll. She's buying him ham rolls now. Yes, Paul snapped. All right, I think it's time I went back to the office now. If you came through the door, I'd suggest you'd better come too. She shook her head. I'd rather walk, thanks, she said. He looked at her. From Ankara. There's shortcuts, she replied. Takes about 10 minutes from here. Ask Countess Judy or Ricky Wormtoter. I guess there's something you haven't got your head round yet. Things can be so much easier if you're with us. And if you're against us, she added, well... I see, Paul said. She grinned. No, you don't. Stupid, she said. I'm not threatening you, or anything like that. In fact, I probably still like you, if only because you get up our Dennis's nose so much. I'm just telling you, that's all. I don't know, she went on, finishing her coffee and licking the last smear of froth off the inside of the rim.
Maybe I'm just getting soft-hearted in my old age, but there's no excuse for you. What's on the surface isn't good enough. You've got to have solid milk chocolate all the way through. Bloody humans.
I thought you said I was shallow and pathetic.
I was being nice. On goblin terms, I mean. We pride ourselves on shallow. I guess that's why your lot's never liked us very much.
I suppose so, Paul said, politely.
Balls, she grinned again. You lot don't like us because we've got big teeth and claws and we only like our food if it's still twitching a bit. And we don't look like you. I'll say this much for us. We're much more broad-minded. I mean, lots of goblin girls fancy humans.
Paul swallowed.
Really? Straight up. We aren't bothered because you don't look like us. Looks don't matter to us, you see, because we can be anyone or anything we like. That comes in dead handy when you're shallow like us, she sighed. I know what you're thinking, she said, and you're right. We look like horrible savage monsters, and we act like it too, whereas your lot are all straight backs and smooth skins and ethics and right and wrong and doing the decent thing by each other and wanting to make the world a better place. Probably that's why we fancy you, purely on a short-term backseat of a car basis. There's not a lot to be said for our mob, really, except we've all got all the money and we mostly have all the fun.
She looked at him, then clicked her tongue.
Mostly, anyhow.
She stood up. A waiter fell over a table.
Oh, and one other thing. I didn't put you-know-what in your desk drawer, and neither did our Dennis. And it sure is baggery didn't get there on its own. Now you think on.
Paul jumped up. Hold on, he said. Do you know who put it there?
Yeah,
saw him do it. Fine, who was it? But she shook her head.
Really and truly I'd like to tell you, she said, but I'm not allowed. Honestly, she added, just watch out, that's all. There's a whole lot of stuff going on at the moment. Most of it's nothing to do with you, but, she shrugged, be careful. You've managed to get yourself mixed up with some very unusual people. Not like the sort you grew up with. Compared with our lot, even the real bastards where you come from fight fair, give up their seats on trains to old ladies, and only ever play for mash sticks. Like, for example, the very worst your kind can do to each other is kill someone. That's practically vegan when you consider what we get up to sometimes.
The tanner grin flicked across her face.
Not that I'm trying to scare you or anything.
Of course not, Paul replied. And why the hell should I believe anything you tell me anyhow?
She smiled. You know, she said, you've put me in mind of something a kid like you said to me once, not long after we'd had a chat pretty much on the same lines as this one, where I told him to watch his back and he said, yeah, sure. Always stuck in my mind it has, what he said then.
Really? What was that then?
Mr. Tanner's mum replied. Be seeing ya.